Hey, good morning, everybody. Welcome to our teaching time for Vancouver Eastside Vineyard on this Palm Sunday, March 28th. And welcome to everyone joining us also by YouTube, either now or other times or places. We're glad you're with us. We're continuing our teaching series this morning on embodiment, looking at the good news through the eyes of John the Beloved as we work our way through the book of John, looking at his front row seat on this most incredible event that ever happened in human history, where God became embodied, God became human, and how that God wants to continue that embodiment now through us. And for the last 3 weeks, we've been looking at this amazing story of the woman at the well, the Samaritan woman, Jesus' encounter with her. And it's probably I think it's the longest conversation that is recorded between Jesus and anybody in the Gospels, other than his teaching, of course. So that's amazing. It says something. And Joanna and Kate have done such a wonderful job laying the foundation and covering the first 2 weeks. But we're still in this encounter with this Samaritan woman. And if you're following us today on YouTube, our text was from John chapter 4, verses 27 to 42, which we've already read together as a church. And that's where I'll be speaking from today. And I want to start by asking you if you can think of a time in your life when you locked into something that was so intense. It gave you so much joy to do that it seemed like everything else went on hold. Your whole life went on hold. It's like, and I mean a good thing. It was the sense I was so born for this. And you almost forgot to eat, and you felt like you couldn't sleep. You didn't want to go to bed at night, and you couldn't wait to get up in the morning for your feet to hit the floor. Well, this kind of occurrence happens in our text today, and it reminds me of an incident that would often occur when I was growing up in northern Alberta in a small farming community in the South Peace Country. And a lot of the members of our church were farmers. And it seemed like this event would happen for them every September. They would go AWOL. They would disappear. And the reason is it was harvest time. And it meant that everything else was put on hold. It was 24/7. It was like 2 or 3 weeks of just bringing in that barley harvest or that wheat harvest. And their whole livelihood, they saw, their whole coming year, their Thanksgivings, their Christmases, were all dependent on these intense few weeks. And you could sense just the excitement and the joy of these farmers. And this was kind of what happened in Jesus. And to give us context for this, let's remember that this whole story of this woman that he encountered at the well began with the statement by John where Jesus had been ministering in Jerusalem and then he'd moved to Judea, and he was taking the normal route that Jewish people would go back to Galilee where Jesus lived. But he does a head fake. It looks like he's going to do the Jewish thing, but then it says, John makes the statement, but he needed to go through Samaria. Well, that geographically just wasn't true. Jesus did. He was going up the Jordan Valley. It meets the Sea of Galilee. If you know your geography, he didn't need to go through Samaria. But there's something at a deeper level going on here. And of course, we know it wasn't geographical. It had to do with his mission. And our mission, of course, is to love well. We've summed that up as a church. And it was the mission of Jesus that he lived out, modeled as an embodied person for his disciples, with his disciples. And so it was a shock already for them to just deliberately head through Samaritan territory. And I don't need to go through the history, but there was extreme racial, religious hostility, ancient. And these two groups, the Jewish people and the Samaritans, hated each other. And it was actually dangerous to pass through each other's territory, not unlike what's happening today with the Palestinians in Israel. And so there was this strange step, this strange statement that John makes. Why did Jesus need to go? Well, part of loving well, of course, is, as Richard Rohr says, to love God with all our heart is to love everything. And it starts with receiving God's unconditional love for ourselves. If you think about it, where do you have a greater opportunity to show unconditional love than toward yourself? Who knows you better than you know yourself? And man, have I ever been struggling with that lately. And there's a rise of irritation. And even this morning, we're in shock from a terrible mass killing or mass stabbing that's occurred on the North Shore. And people have died in a library area, in a shopping center on the North Shore. And there's such an increase of mental illness and irritation. And we're all, I think, being confronted with ourselves in the middle of this pandemic. And I know I am. I find myself increasingly irritated. And I don't know if it's because of aging, more aches and pains. I just seem to be more clumsy. I drop things. I forget things. I don't know if it's the pandemic that's confusing and disorienting and because of a lack of connection. But I sometimes hear myself saying things like, "You idiot, how could you forget that?" And I know it just grieves the heart of God for me even to say that. Sometimes I even say worse. It can't be said in a Christian sermon. And it just so breaks the heart of God when the Lord reminds me of how would I feel if I saw my child or my wife or my grandchildren saying that about themselves. And so loving ourselves is the first practice in unconditional love that is so important because we know ourselves better than anyone else except for God. But then that love, growing in love and loving well, extends to loving others. And it's the first category of loving others is loving our family, people who are like us, people of similar race or religion, ethnicity. It's why we get so excited at the World Cup or at the Olympics. We get so patriotic, cheering for our country. And that's healthy and that's good. It's not wrong to love your own. But love doesn't stop there. Love continues to loving the other, loving those who are not like us, people who are of a different race, that eat different kinds of food, that are, even our enemies can be included in the other. And that is also where we are called to love. And that is, all of these loves are interconnected. They're that unconditional love of God. And it's interconnected because when we struggle with hate towards the other, maybe it's homophobia or racism or whatever it is, we are actually hating parts of ourselves that are alienated and estranged. And so loving of the self and loving of the others is all interconnected. And Jesus knew this, and he knew this was so important. Do you realize that this occurrence in Samaria happened before he ever preached the Sermon on the Mount about loving your enemies? The disciples were actually watching a video, a live story and revealing of what that looked like before Jesus ever even talked about it. And so Jesus needed to go through Samaria. And on their journey, as we've heard in the previous weeks, as they're traveling through Samaria, they come to this well. And it's midday, and the disciples have gone into Sychar or Shechem, the town that was nearby, for food, a risky adventure, I'm sure, in itself. And Jesus is sitting there alone. He's thirsty, he's tired, he's hungry from the journey and his embodied self. And this lone woman comes, and he does the unthinkable in relating to the other. And yet it is the essential starting point in loving the other, in that he asks her for help. He asks her for a drink of water. He acknowledges, he sees her. He's embodied and present to her, and he acknowledges that she has something that he needs, that she can help him at that point. And that is such a critical starting point in bridge building, in reaching and loving and serving the other. And of course, he broke all social and cultural conventions in doing that, because rabbis did not talk to women in public. In fact, most Jewish men did not talk to a woman in public. And of course, she was a Samaritan. And even to touch the same jar of water that she held, Jews would regard themselves as ceremonially unclean. So it was a radical action for Jesus to do. And of course, this engendered a whole conversation that moved to living water. And he talked about living water that he had for her. And living water, we need to understand, for them was not some super spiritual thing. Living water was actually meant running water. That's what it meant. And it piqued her interest because Jesus was talking about a source of water that would have been fresher, because running water would have been better than well water. But it also offered her an opportunity to a place of estrangement, social isolation, and rejection, where she had to come every day for water. She was looking for an alternative. So when Jesus offered her this living water, that got her attention. But of course, Jesus was already offering her that water. She was already drinking it. She just didn't know it. And you know what that living water was? It was God's unconditional love. It was his embodiment, his body language, his eye contact, the respect he showed her, the dignity he gave her. He listened to her. He valued her story. And I'm sure as she conversed with this strange man who seemed surprisingly safe, I'm sure there was something in her heart that said, well, if only he knew what I was really like, he wouldn't be showing me this kind of dignity, this kind of honor, and this kind of respect. And almost on cue, Jesus asked her to go and bring her husband, which of course brought the unveiling that he knew that she'd had 5 husbands, and that the man that she was now living with was not her husband. And all that shame and alienation and social isolation that she'd been feeling came back in a flood. And she watched carefully for any sign of rejection, any sign of diminishing of that respect, and his posture of turning away. But it didn't change. It didn't change at all. He continued to converse with her, engaging her heart and her mind so respectfully, to the point that he does the unthinkable. This is overwhelming to me. Jesus, at the end of the conversation, says to her, tells her what he doesn't willingly or voluntarily do for anyone else in the recorded scriptures. He tells her directly, he is the Christ. He is the Messiah. Wow. What does that tell you about the living water that Jesus was offering to the other? Well, right at this moment, the disciples came back and they have lunch, and there's this kind of awkward moment because they're shocked that he's talking to a woman. She's shocked that he talked to a Samaritan. All he wanted was a conversation and a drink of water and living water. And the woman senses the awkwardness, so she does what you do. She says, excuse me, I'll be going now. But actually, she went running into town, left the disciples in that awkward moment with Jesus, not knowing what to say to him and not daring ask. And she goes into town and she forgets her shame, whatever social isolation and rejection she encountered in that town or city. She's forgotten it all. And in her excitement, she declares, I have found a man. Come and see. Come and see. There's that phrase again we see in John often. Come and see. A man who told me everything I've ever done. Maybe a bit of an exaggeration, but he knows me. He knows me. He read my mail, we like to say. But that wasn't the clincher. The clincher was he still loved me. He still respected me. he still accepted me and forgave me. Could this be the Christ? Could this be the Messiah? Well, there was something about the urgency of her voice and the way that she told her story that it grabbed the crowd, and they began to make their way from the town to the well. Now, there was this valley, and that well, by the way, is still there. It's 136 feet deep. It's still there in the Middle East. And they were making their way from the town, and there was this valley. So I want you to picture this valley between the town and the well, so you could see people coming out of the city towards the well from where you were at the well. And the disciples, in that moment of awkwardness, let's go back to them for a moment. They say to Jesus, let's eat. That, eating kind of breaks the ice a little bit, doesn't it? And again, Jesus shocks them. He says, I've already eaten. And they said, did somebody bring you some food? And he said, my food is to do the will of him who sent me and to finish his work, to be embodied, to allow God to be embodied, to love the other. It kind of reminds me how I used to feel sometimes when I'd go to the chili wagon, and it was kind of around supper time, and I'd forget to eat, and I'd go to chili wagon, and I was supposed to eat the chili, but I'd get involved in a conversation, and there'd be this God connection, and I'd go home, and I'd realize it felt like I'd already eaten. Felt like even though I hadn't had physical supper, I'd already had food. I think Jesus was describing that kind of moment with these disciples. And then he starts talking about this harvest again. He says, don't you say that there's 4 months until harvest? And probably as he said that, he was looking out at the grain fields between Sychar and the well, and they'd just been planted. It was kind of in the spring or the early planting, sowing time, where little green shoots were coming out of the ground. And physically, it would have been another 4 months before harvest. But then you see this crowd of people coming from Sychar. And Jesus says, don't say there's 4 months. Look. He said, open your eyes. Look, see. And all these people came because of the magnetism of Photine's testimony. That was her name. She became a saint in the Eastern Orthodox Church. As Joanna mentioned, she was regarded as equal to the apostles because she became a flaming good newser, and she brought so many people to Christ in her life before she died as a martyr. And Jesus did the unthinkable. The crowd came out to him, and they said to him, can you stay in Samaria? Can you stay in our village or city for a few days? And he did the unthinkable. When the disciples, confused and baffled, he said to them, maybe with a wink, it's harvest time. It's harvest time. And many, many came to believe on him. So let me again ask, when has there been a time like that in your life where it's been harvest time? What gives you so much joy and exhilaration that you feel like you don't want to eat or sleep? You're so excited. You say to yourself, I was born for this. As I was reflecting on this question, I was reminded of a time in Calgary, not long before we moved to Vancouver. Kathleen and I were at this church breakfast in the gymnasium of our church in Calgary, and everybody was sitting at tables of 8 or 10 and round tables, and this prophetic guy named Dick Mills, who has since passed away, who I deeply loved and respected, was getting tablefuls of people to stand up, and he would actually prophesy over the whole table. And he was a kind of read your mail kind of prophetic guy. It was sometimes incredibly accurate. In fact, he's been very instrumental, the words that he's given me in giving me direction and hope and assurance and just the confidence to know that I'm walking in hearing God and following God. And this particular day, this morning, he was prophesying to different tables. And when he came to our table, he asked us all to stand. And Kathleen and I were with a group of 8 or 10 young adults at this round table. And they were all a group of people that had just recently traveled with us to England for a lot of street dramas and ministry. And they're a very artsy group. And there was people with colored hair and piercings, I think some tattoos, and they were at that time, it was 1989, I think, or 88, somewhere around there. They were not the kind of people that fit into the conventional church at the time. And I remember Dick looking at us and he said, you are called as a people to make a place for those who feel they have no place. You are called to include people who don't feel included, who don't feel part of the church. That is your mission and that is your calling. Well, the cynical part of me said, well, look at us, Dick. It's not hard to figure that out. That doesn't sound that prophetic. But you know, that word just came and sunk. It just sank into my heart and it just lodged there. And that shaped our coming to Vancouver. It shaped the forming of Vancouver Eastside Vineyard. Our founding pastors had that vision that we would be, because they were former hippies that found a church that loved them and didn't ask them to cut their hair and straighten out their life before they came in, quote unquote. And they wanted to carry that same vision in the planting of our church. And I've felt that joy of harvest at different times where we have tapped into that as a church. I know I felt it. The first week we went to Lower Post, we drove 2,000 kilometers by car. We spent a whole week and it was like a river of tears as we wept tears of repentance for the sins of racism and the sins of the residential school right there in Lower Post. Frances Sini was there with us, with her mother Lorna, who had invited us. And I wept tears of joy as at the end of that week we baptized dozens of people, children, teenagers, adults. One of those children is now the chief in Lower Post. But I became aware that many, many people had sowed in tears for years before we ever came. Lorna and other faithful people in that community had prayed and asked God to touch that village, to heal that village. And this was one of those experiences where the sower and the reaper were rejoicing together. And for me, the penny dropped. Here's the clincher. Because life is usually not about harvest in this life. It's usually about sowing. In fact, harvest is not sustainable. You can't go many days without eating and sleeping, and it's going to burn you out. Most of our life is about sowing. But what Jesus said in this upside down kingdom is that the joy of the harvest and the joy of the sower comes together. It's a shared joy. And they rejoice together. And so I have felt this joy as a pastor. Whenever we've done community barbecues or parties in the park and we've had a chance to love people who would otherwise never darken the door of a church, I have felt it over and over at Chili Wagon. As I realized that faithful people like Gordie and Shannon and Dave and Dean and many others that faithfully did way more work than I ever did, I would come in and have these encounters and I'd get out my guitar and start to sing, I'm forgiven because you were forsaken. I'm accepted. You were condemned. I'm alive and well. Your spirit lives within me. Because you died and rose again, and in encounter after encounter with people like Bobby and others, we experienced together the joy of the sower and the reaper. We ate a meal that went far beyond the physical food. And so, embodiment means continually drinking deeply, dear brothers and sisters, from the well of God's unconditional love. First of all, for yourself. Continually drinking and then giving that love to others, your own, others like you, and then to the other, others who are not like you. And in doing so, finding ourselves reconciled from those parts of our estranged and alienated selves. May God bless you as you continue to drink deeply from the wells of those living waters. Grace and peace to you.